The Wall Between Us, A Town's Silent Divide. Chapter 1. Cracks in the Sidewalk. In a quiet, picturesque town where everything appears perfect on the surface, where lawns are trimmed, smiles are routine, and Sunday mornings smell of fresh coffee, young Emily begins to notice something different. She's only 11, but there's a sensitivity in her that picks up what others ignore. Some neighbors never greet each other, some children are steered away from certain streets, shops line both sides of the main road, yet their customers never seem to mix. One day after school, Emily stumbles over a deep crack in the sidewalk and stops. As she kneels down to inspect it, she notices a series of other cracks, like a spider web spreading through the concrete. Fractures that were always there but had gone unnoticed. She begins to see them everywhere. That night, she sketches a map of her town, drawing lines where people don't speak, where tension seems to live. Her parents brush off her questions with distracted answers. "That's just how it's always been," they say. But to Emily, those words feel heavier than they should. At school, she starts observing who sits where, who eats with whom, and which lockers never receive a glance from others. The division is quiet, almost polite, but it's there. As days pass, she realizes the cracks she sees aren't just in cement. They're in the town's memory, in the silences at dinner tables, in the way people cross the street a little too soon, in the way a shopkeeper's smile falters when certain customers walk in. Emily can't explain it all, but she knows something is wrong, and she's not the kind of girl to look away. She doesn't know it yet, but this small realization, this noticing of the unseen, will begin a journey that will not only change her, but the town itself. A journey that begins with a sidewalk crack and ends with the breaking of a wall no one admits exists. Chapter 2. Whispers Behind Closed Doors. Behind the carefully drawn curtains and flower-filled windowsills, the town's homes hum with more than the sound of dinner being made or television playing softly. There's another hum quieter, but heavier. It is the hum of rumors, secrets, and generational caution passed down in hushed voices. These aren't merely gossip, but inherited beliefs, shaped by events that no one talks about openly. Emily begins to notice how certain names make adults fall silent. She hears her grandmother whisper about a woman from the other side, and watches how her mother quickly changes the subject. Once, during a sleepover, she hears a friend's father say, "We don't trust them," without ever saying who them is. She starts writing these things down in a notebook, piecing together a puzzle no one wants solved. Each whisper carries weight. It decides who gets invited and who stays outside. It determines who gets second chances and who never had a first. But there's never evidence, just stories, shadowy anecdotes that shape real choices. Emily realizes that fear doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it sounds like bedtime advice. And so the town continues, its heart beating beneath closed doors and quiet hallways. But Emily, now listening more closely than ever, begins to understand. What isn't said can sometimes do more harm than what is. Chapter 3. The Fence That Grew Taller. It started with a backyard disagreement. Nothing major, just a dispute over tree branches and property lines. But one neighbor added a few extra boards to their fence, and then another neighbor followed suit. Soon, a simple wooden divider transformed into a looming metal barrier topped with barbed wire. Surveillance cameras were installed. Children stopped playing near it. People crossed the street to avoid walking alongside it. As weeks passed, more fences began to appear between homes, around schools, even bordering the town's park. It wasn't mandated. There were no official announcements. It simply became normal, the way fear often does. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the town had split itself in two. Emily began calling it the line of forgetting, because over time, people forgot what the town used to look like without barriers. The community center that once held dance classes and bake sales now had a separate entrance for each side. The local market stopped offering shared discounts. Even the church choir split, their harmony broken. No one openly acknowledged the change. They just adjusted. That was perhaps the scariest part to Emily, how easily people accept division when it builds slowly. One day, while walking with Aiden, she reached out and touched the cold steel of the main fence. "This didn't grow taller overnight," she said softly. "We let it grow." The fence wasn't just a structure. It was a symbol of fear disguised as protection, of comfort built on isolation. And Emily knew then, if it had grown one board at a time, it could be taken down the same way, but only if someone dared to start. Chapter 4: Echoes of an Unspoken Past. One rainy afternoon, while searching through boxes in her late grandfather's study, Emily hears a hollow echo beneath the floor. Curious, she pulls up a loose board and finds a dusty, leather-bound diary bound with twine. The pages are brittle, stained with time, and filled with a script both elegant and trembling. As she begins to read, she realizes the diary belonged to a young woman named Ruth, a name Emily has never heard spoken in her family. Ruth's entries begin with childhood memories, shared picnics in the town square, laughter at school, her first friendship with a boy named Eli from across the river. But slowly, the tone changes. Ruth writes of tension growing, of whispered warnings from adults, of rules that began to appear without reason. One day, she and Eli are told they can no longer see each other. Ruth doesn't understand. Neither does Eli. Their friendship fades, not because they wanted it to, but because the world around them said it had to. Emily reads about a secret meeting Ruth and Eli had beneath the old oak tree, the same one near the split in the town park. There, Ruth buried a letter Eli gave her. "For the day the wall falls," he had written. Emily is stunned. She never knew the oak tree had any significance, never knew her town had been the backdrop for such heartbreak. The diary reveals how the town's divide wasn't created by a single event, but by a slow erosion of trust, manipulated by fear, sealed by silence. Ruth writes, "They told us forgetting would protect us, but forgetting is what built the wall." As Emily finishes the final entry, tears blur the ink. She feels an ache that isn't hers, but somehow is. Ruth's voice echoes in her mind, begging to be heard, to be remembered. And Emily knows then, this story needs to be shared, because healing can't begin unless the truth is spoken aloud. The diary becomes Emily's compass. It teaches her that history isn't just facts in a book. It's feelings buried in basements, voices hidden in wood, and pain passed down like old furniture. It teaches her that silence is never neutral. It either protects the truth or hides it. Chapter 5. Two Streets, Two Worlds. When a school project is announced in Ms. Carter's history class, one that requires students to pair up and explore the town's founding, Emily expects to be grouped with one of her usual classmates. Instead, the teacher places her with Aiden, a boy from the other side of town. A murmur runs through the room. No one says anything, but Emily can feel the sideways glances. Aiden doesn't react. He simply nods and begins taking notes. Their first meeting is awkward. Emily fidgets while Aiden barely speaks. They sit on opposite sides of a library table, surrounded by dusty town records and black and white photographs. But then they stumble across a newspaper clipping featuring a young girl and boy, Ruth and Eli. The headline reads, "Community honors long-lost friendship." The article is short, vague, and leaves more questions than answers. But it sparks something. Over the next few days, Emily and Aiden begin digging deeper. They conduct interviews with longtime residents, most of whom are hesitant to talk. They visit the town archives, sort through old letters, and trace property maps showing how the divide slowly crept in over decades. As they work, their own wall begins to crack. Emily learns Aiden loves to draw. He sketches buildings while waiting for her to finish notes. Aiden discovers Emily writes poetry, though she hides it like a secret. They begin meeting outside school, sometimes under the oak tree Ruth once wrote about. One afternoon, Aiden asks, "Do you think people will ever care about what we find?" Emily doesn't answer right away. Instead, she hands him a photograph of Ruth and Eli. "They will," she says, "if we tell it right." What began as a simple assignment becomes a mission. They aren't just gathering facts. They're uncovering the emotional truth of their town, and in doing so, they're rewriting the narrative that shaped their own beliefs. Emily begins to see the town not as a place defined by invisible fences and inherited mistrust, but as a canvas waiting for a new story to be drawn. In a notebook Emily once used for scribbling whispers and rumors, she now writes something different. Maybe two streets really can become one world. Maybe all it takes is two voices brave enough to speak together. Chapter 6. The Boy Who Crossed the Line. As the town's summer festival approaches, tension lingers in the air like humidity, thick, invisible, and inescapable. The festival, held on the east side of town, has become an unofficial celebration exclusive to one half of the community. It wasn't always like this. Years ago, it was a shared tradition. But now, the lines are clear. Emily and Aiden talk about it during one of their study sessions. "You should come," she says without thinking. Aiden hesitates. "They won't want me there." Emily shrugs. "Then let's change what they means." On the day of the festival, Aiden walks toward the crowd alone, guitar strapped across his back. Heads turn, some people step aside, a few whisper, but Emily meets him at the entrance, her smile unwavering. Together, they find a small space near the main tent, where Aiden begins to play. His fingers tremble at first, but the chords settle him. His song, written quietly in his room the week before, tells a story of division, of loss, and of longing for unity. It doesn't preach, it remembers. People stop to listen. Some cry, some stay silent. but no one walks away. When the song ends, the applause is hesitant but real. For a brief moment, the air shifts. The town breathes together, but the moment doesn't last. An older man mutters, "That wasn't the place for him." A mother pulls her child away. A few families leave early. That night, Emily overhears her parents arguing about her friendship with Aiden. At school the next day, Aiden finds his locker defaced. "Stay on your side," it reads in red marker. Emily's heart aches when she sees it, but Aiden just smiles sadly. "I guess I crossed a line," he says. But Emily disagrees. "No," she says, "you opened a door." And though the pushback hurts, it also confirms something for them both. Change begins at the edge of discomfort. Aiden's presence challenged the silence. His song gave it a sound. And once something has been heard, it can't be unheard. Chapter 7. Letters Never Sent. The attic was a place Emily had never explored fully. Its wooden beams heavy with dust and cobwebs, its air thick with forgotten memories. One Saturday, while helping her mum clean, Emily stumbled upon an old trunk pushed against the far wall. Inside were faded photographs, brittle lace gloves, a crumbling yearbook, and at the very bottom, a stack of neatly tied envelopes, their edges curled with age. Curious, Emily opened one, then another, and another. They were letters, all addressed to a name she didn't recognize, Margaret. Each one was written in delicate script, full of love and longing. As she read, she realized they had been written by a man named Elijah, Eli, the same Eli from Ruth's diary. Her hands trembled as she made the connection. These letters had never been mailed. They were never meant to be found, but here they were, waiting. The letters told a different story than the town remembered. They spoke of dreams Eli and Margaret had shared, to leave the town, to escape the judgment, to live a life where they didn't have to hide their love. They had made plans to run away. But then, suddenly, the letters stopped. The last one ended with a single line, "I'll wait under the oak tree until the sky forgets our names." Emily felt the weight of those words. She knew that no one in the town had spoken about Eli or Margaret with anything more than a hushed tone, if at all. Their love had been erased not by time, but by silence. She brought the letters to Aiden. Together they sat beneath the same oak tree mentioned in both the diary and the final letter. The branches swayed gently above them as they read each word aloud, letting the past breathe again. Aiden whispered, "Do you think anyone ever knew how much they loved each other?" Emily shook her head. Not enough people. Not enough to stop what happened. They made a decision then not to keep the letters hidden like everyone else had. They would share them. Maybe not with the whole town at once, but with the people who needed to hear them. Because these weren't just letters, they were proof of love, of pain, of history buried not in the ground, but in paper. The attic no longer felt like just a storage space. It was a time capsule. And as Emily and Aiden left that day, arms full of the past, they carried something even greater than memory. They carried the truth. Chapter 8. The day the music stopped. The Summer Music Festival had once been the highlight of the year, a time when the entire town gathered in the park. Children ran barefoot across the grass, and music echoed through the streets long into the night. But now, for the first time in decades, the festival was cancelled. The announcement was short, posted on the town bulletin board. Due to security concerns, the event will not be held this year. Emily read the notice twice, her heart sinking. It wasn't about security. Everyone knew that. The truth hung in the air, unspoken yet heavy. The divide had grown too loud to ignore. The park, once a shared space, had become a border. She and Aiden sat beneath the oak tree that evening, watching the wind stir the empty stage that should have been lit with lanterns and laughter. "It's like the town stopped singing," Aiden said quietly. Determined to fight the silence, they planned their own version of the festival. They called it Echoes of Unity, a backyard concert hosted at Emily's house. They invited classmates, teachers, anyone willing to come. Emily's mum baked cookies, and Aiden set up a small sound system borrowed from the school. Only a handful of people showed up at first, mostly kids, curious and cautious. But when Aiden strummed the first chords and Emily began to sing, something shifted. More people wandered in, drawn by the sound. They didn't talk much, but they listened. Some tapped their feet, others closed their eyes. The concert wasn't perfect. A speaker crackled, rain threatened to fall, but by the end, they had done something no one else had dared to do. They brought music back to a broken town. The next day, a note was left on Emily's porch in an unmarked envelope. It read, "Thank you. I had forgotten how it felt to belong." No name. Just those words. That single night didn't fix everything, but it reminded them all of something vital. When people stop gathering, they forget how to be a community. And when music stops, so do the stories that carry hope. Chapter 9. Eyes That Never Met. On a quiet street where nothing ever seemed to change, two houses stood across from each other like silent sentinels. One painted a pale blue, the other a fading beige. In the blue house lived Mrs. Langford, a retired music teacher who rarely left her porch. In the beige house lived Miss Thomas, a former nurse known for her fiercely trimmed hedges and equally sharp words. For over 40 years, they had lived just 20 yards apart, yet never once exchanged a greeting. To Emily and Aiden, it seemed impossible. How could two people live so close and know so little of one another? Curious, they decided to pay each woman a visit under the guise of a school history project. At first, both women were skeptical. Mrs. Langford stiffened at the knock, and Miss Thomas barely opened the door. But mention of the early days of the town softened their edges, if only slightly. Emily visited Mrs. Langford and asked about her favorite memory from childhood. After a long pause, the old woman shared a story about a song she once played at a community picnic, how the entire town had sung together back when the park was whole. Aiden, speaking to Miss Thomas, heard about the hospital where she worked, the nights she sat by strangers' bedsides, and the day her best friend moved away after the first signs of the town's divide. Neither woman spoke about the other, but one evening, a power outage swept the block, plunging the houses into darkness. Emily and Aiden, who had stayed late to organize notes, lit candles and waited. To their surprise, both women stepped outside. Mrs. Langford wrapped in a quilt, Miss Thomas carrying a lantern. They stood there, bathed in the soft flicker of candlelight, facing each other. No one said anything for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Mrs. Langford said, "I remember your sister. She was kind to my mother." Miss Thomas blinked, then nodded slowly. "Your piano playing kept me company during the war." Emily watched, breath held. Aiden didn't dare move. Two women, separated by silence for decades, were finally meeting, perhaps not to become friends, but to remember that they were human beings who once shared something, a street, a season, a song. Sometimes healing doesn't roar. Sometimes it walks quietly across a porch and says hello for the first time. Chapter 10. The Gathering Storm. The town hall was packed. Standing room only. Tension buzzed in the air like static before a lightning strike. Word had spread quickly after the recent events. The cancelled festival, the music night at Emily's house, and the growing murmur that something had to be done. Chairs creaked under the weight of restless bodies. The mayor tapped his gavel, but it did little to settle the storm that brewed beneath the surface. Emily sat beside Aiden in the back row, clutching a folder filled with notes, letters, and photographs. They hadn't planned to speak. But as the arguments began, about zoning laws, safety concerns, tradition, and order, something shifted. The conversations weren't about solutions. They were about blame. Accusations flew. People raised voices. Old resentments surfaced like ghosts long buried. One woman stood and angrily cited property lines. A man shouted about how outsiders were ruining things. Another woman sobbed, asking why her children couldn't play in the same park she once loved. Every voice carried weight. Every memory carried pain. Emily's hands trembled as she stood. Aiden gave her a small nod, steady and calm. She walked to the front, heart hammering, and turned to face the crowd. "I wasn't going to speak," she began, "but I think someone needs to remind us of what we've forgotten." She held up her letter, the one Ely had written to Margaret. Her voice cracked as she read aloud the final lines. Then she spoke about Ruth's diary, about the oak tree, about the bridge, the music, the pain, and the silence that stitched it all together. "This isn't just about fences," she said. "It's about hearts that stopped trusting each other and stories that were never allowed to be told." The room fell still. Not silent, but still. People looked at one another, really looked, for the first time in years. One man stood and said, "I remember Ellie. He fixed my father's roof, never charged him a cent." Another said, "Margaret was my aunt. She loved this town, even when it didn't love her back." The mayor put down his gavel. The storm wasn't over. But it had been named. And once a storm is named, it becomes something a town can prepare for, can face together. Chapter 11. Secrets in the Basement. The town library had always seemed like a relic from another age. Its wooden shelves heavy with forgotten stories, its staircases groaning with each careful step. But hidden beneath it all was a basement that few people knew existed. One afternoon, driven by a tip from Mrs. Langford, Emily and Aiden asked the librarian about it. With a reluctant nod, she handed them a key and said, "Be careful what you're looking for. Some things are buried for a reason." They descended the stairs slowly, their flashlights slicing through the dim. The basement was cold, lined with metal cabinets and cardboard boxes. Dust hung in the air like fog. Emily opened a file labeled Town Council Records, 1962. Aiden opened one marked Zoning Disputes. What they found shocked them both. The records weren't just minutes and ordinances. They were blueprints for division. There were memos about unofficial redlining, correspondence between community leaders encouraging the segregation of housing, and private meeting notes that referenced keeping things familiar and avoiding disruption. Even worse, there were signed letters from people Emily recognized, shopkeepers, family friends, even a past mayor supporting these decisions. The language was careful but clear. The town hadn't simply grown apart. It had been carefully separated. Aiden found a box labeled Testimonies. Inside were cassette tapes, each labeled with a name and a year. They listened to one, an old man recounting how he was denied a business permit because of where he lived. Another tape held the tearful voice of a woman who had been told her child would be safer at a different school. Emily felt overwhelmed. The basement was more than storage. It was a burial ground for truth. "We have to share this," she said. Aiden nodded, but his voice was heavy. "They're not ready." But Emily believed they had to be. Because every wall ever built had an architect, and every silence had a source. They left the basement with boxes in hand. Not just of documents, but of courage. They would not let this be buried again. Chapter 12. The Bridge We Burned. It happened in the early morning hours, before the sun rose, before the bakery opened, before the bus routes began. Flames lit the sky above the small wooden bridge that connected East Side and West Side, a modest walkway that once symbolized hope. Now, it was reduced to charred beams and smoke. Emily woke to sirens and the smell of ash. From her bedroom window, she saw the glow still lingering in the air, the orange haze washing over rooftops like a warning. She and Aiden raced to the scene, joining a growing crowd that gathered at the riverbank. No one said much. There were no gasps, no cries, only a silence deeper than grief. Because this wasn't just a bridge, it was a message. Authorities claimed the fire was accidental, but everyone knew it wasn't. Someone had doused that bridge in gasoline. Someone had decided that the connection, however symbolic it represented, was too dangerous to remain standing. Emily stared across the river. Aiden beside her clenched his fists. "They didn't just burn wood," he said. "They burned memory. They burned possibility." The mayor called for calm. The newspaper printed a photo of the wreckage with the headline, "Unfortunate Loss." But Emily saw through the language. This wasn't misfortune. It was fear, manifesting itself in fire. That night, she and Aiden returned with candles. They placed them where the bridge had once begun, lighting the space between them with quiet defiance. Others came too, one by one, placing their own candles in the dirt. No speeches, no slogans, just light. It became a ritual. For a week the bank glowed at dusk. The flames that had divided them now inspired a flickering unity. Emily wrote in her journal, "Some bridges fall with a roar. Others we let crumple. But the hardest ones to rebuild are the ones no one remembers crossing in the first place." She and Aiden promised to rebuild not just the structure, but the spirit. Because if something can be burned down by hate, it can be built again by hope. Chapter 13. Shadows on the Playground. It began with a game of tag. Emily and Aiden watched from a distance as the younger students ran across the school playground. But it wasn't the laughter or footsteps that caught their attention. It was the way the children moved, split into two groups, always staying on opposite sides of the field. One child tried to bridge the space, tagging a friend from the other group. The others froze. Whispers started. The tagged child was told to go back to your side. No adult intervened. It was just a game. But Emily knew better. Games reflect what children see, and what they were seeing was division. At lunch, she noticed similar patterns. Tables that never mixed, jokes about those kids, mimicked phrases from overheard adult conversations. Aiden overheard a teacher dismissively say, "That's just how it is here." So Emily and Aiden did something simple yet radical. They started a storytelling circle. It wasn't official, just a few students gathered beneath the big oak tree during recess. The rule was simple: share something true about yourself, and everyone listens. No teasing, no judging. The first few days were quiet, but then a boy named Marcus talked about how he missed his old friend who moved away after their parents fought. A girl named Lily shared how her grandmother warned her not to play with those kinds of kids, and how that made her feel confused and sad. Soon, more stories flowed about pets, about fears, about dreams. Walls that had formed from inherited ideas began to soften, brick by invisible brick. One day, a teacher stopped by, then a second, then the principal, who quietly asked if they could make this official. Emily smiled. It already is. The playground hadn't changed physically, but something else had. Children began choosing teammates from both sides. Laughter returned, shared, not separated. And Emily realized something powerful. Healing doesn't always start in town halls or protests. Sometimes it begins where the next generation chooses not to carry the same fear forward. Chapter 14. When Silence Screamed. It started with smoke. Not from a fire this time, but from the exhaust of fire trucks, the bustle of ambulances, the cries of panic as an apartment building on the town's edge filled with flames. The building was one of the few places where people from both sides of the town lived side by side, not by choice, but by necessity. Emily and Aiden arrived to the chaos just as families were being pulled from balconies, children wrapped in wet towels, mothers crying out names. The sirens wailed, but the louder sound, the one no one could ignore, was the scream of silence breaking. Neighbors rushed in to help. Lines blurred. A man from the east side kicked in a door to save an elderly woman from the west side. A teenage girl from west side carried water to east side children coughing from smoke. No one asked which side you were from. No one cared. Emily and Aiden moved through the crowd, helping where they could, holding hands, comforting strangers. They saw the mayor, soot on his jacket, guiding people to safety. They saw Miss Thomas hand her blanket to a child she didn't know. Later, at the shelter set up in the school gym, Emily looked around at people sleeping shoulder to shoulder. There was no wall here, just humans worn down by fear and lifted by kindness. The next morning, the town's newspaper ran a rare double-page photo. People of every background sitting together on the gym floor, sharing coffee, sharing stories. The headline read, "Together we remembered. For Emily, the fire wasn't just a tragedy, it was a turning point. Because sometimes it takes devastation to tear through denial. Sometimes silence needs to scream before anyone listens. She didn't need to write this moment in her journal. She knew she would never forget it. Chapter 15. Tearing Down the Wall. It began quietly, with a single hammer swing. One man, no longer young but steady in his stance, struck the edge of the metal barrier that had loomed for years at the center of town. His action was unannounced, spontaneous. At first, people watched from their porches and sidewalks, unsure. But then, a woman joined him with a crowbar. A teenager appeared with a shovel. And then came Emily, holding Aiden's hand, carrying a paint-chipped sledgehammer that once belonged to her grandfather. The town didn't move like a parade or a protest. It moved like a tide. Slowly, steadily, citizens crossed the line they had tiptoed around for generations. One by one, they added their strength, not with chance or fury, but with focused hands and tearful eyes. Each brick removed felt like lifting a weight off memory. Every thud of stone against pavement echoed louder than any speech ever had. By sunset, the first opening in the wall stood clear, just wide enough for a child to walk through. A small boy did exactly that. On the other side, he met a girl. They stared at each other for a long moment, and then, without fanfare, began playing. Emily and Aiden stepped back, watching, exhausted and emotional. The air smelled of dust and renewal. Someone started singing softly, an old tune from the town's forgotten songbook. Others joined. Voices that had stayed silent for too long now wove into a harmony both fragile and fierce. In the days that followed, pieces of the wall were carried away in wagons and wheelbarrows. Some saved them as reminders. Others crushed them into gravel to pave a shared path. Plans were drawn to build a community garden where the wall once stood. The land, once a symbol of division, would now bloom. Emily wrote the final entry in her journal beneath the oak tree. The wall was never just stone and steel, she penned. It was silence, fear, and forgotten names. But we remembered. And in remembering, we became one. As she closed the book, Aiden looked at her and said, "Do you think it will stay down this time?" She smiled. "Only if we keep telling the story."